Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at how conspiracy theories spread online.
Okay.
And we're going to be using the Pizzagate theory as a fascinating case study. You've given us some academic papers on this.
Yeah.
And I have to say, using narrative analysis to dissect something like this is really intriguing.
It is, yeah. It's about going beyond just that surface level of what happened and really understanding how this particular conspiracy was constructed and spread and evolved online.
Right, like we're uncovering the skeleton of the story to see what holds it all together, right?
Exactly.
And then we're going to compare this with how a real political scandal, Bridgegate, was reported on. It should be interesting to see if those narrative structures look the same or totally different.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be diving into these academic papers to see if we can spot like these recurring patterns in how these narratives are built.
Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick refresher, Pizzagate was this totally baseless conspiracy theory that popped up during the 2016 election.
The main claim was that high-ranking Democratic Party members, including Hillary Clinton, were running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza place in Washington, D.C. called Comet Ping Pong.
Yeah, and just to be super clear up front, there's absolutely zero evidence to support any of this, right?
Correct. Numerous investigations found no wrongdoing at Comet Ping Pong.
Right.
And the claims made about certain emails were completely debunked.
Yet, as we know, Pizzagate took hold online and even led to like a real-world incident where someone showed up at Comet Ping Pong with a gun.
Right.
It's unsettling how something with zero proof can have such a real impact.
It is, and that's precisely why, analyzing the narrative structure of Pizzagate is so crucial to understanding how it gained traction and how to potentially counter such misinformation in the future.
Okay, so let's get into it. I see one of the papers you provided used something called narrative framework analysis to break down thousands of Pizzagate-related posts.
Yes.
What exactly does that involve?
So it's a method researchers use to dissect complex narratives and identify the core elements driving the story.
Okay.
Think of it like building a house.
Okay.
You have the individual bricks, or in this case, actants.
Actants. Is that just a fancy word for characters?
Essentially, yes. Actants can be individuals like Hillary Clinton or John Podesta, but also places like Comet Ping Pong. Or even concepts like Satanism.
Interesting. So they identified these actants within the Pizzagate posts. And then what? Did they just make a list?
Not quite. They went a step further and mapped out the relationships between these actants.
Okay, so instead of just listing the bricks, they looked at how the bricks were connected to form the structure of the house.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
Yeah, by mapping these connections, the researchers could uncover the underlying framework of the Pizzagate narrative.
Okay.
Almost like a blueprint.
Okay, now I'm really curious to hear what they found.
Yeah.
What did this blueprint reveal?
One of the most fascinating findings was how Pizzagate links together seemingly unrelated domains.
Okay.
You have politics, restaurants, and even the occult, all intertwined within a single narrative.
You're right. That eye is fascinating because on the surface, those things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. It's like someone saying, my dog ate my homework, therefore the moon landing was faked. How do they even connect those dots?
That's precisely what makes this multi-domain connection so powerful.
Okay.
It creates a sense of a grand, all-encompassing conspiracy, making it more difficult for believers to just dismiss.
Because if everything is connected, then any attempts to debunk one piece of it can be waved away as just scratching the surface, right?
Exactly. And Pizzagate provides a very clear example of this.
Okay.
You had the leaked Podesta emails, which were largely about mundane things like dinner plans, but conspiracy theorists interpreted them as containing coded messages about child trafficking.
So they took something completely ordinary and twisted it to fit their pre-existing narrative.
Right.
It's almost like creative writing,
but
with a really dark and disturbing twist.
That's a very apt comparison, and the researchers found that a key element in this creative writing process was WikiLeaks and their release of the Podesta emails. They acted as a sort of keystone in the Pizzagate narrative structure.
A keystone? Like if you remove it, the whole thing crumbles.
Precisely. Their analysis showed that removing WikiLeaks from the narrative map actually cause the whole Pizzagate story to just break down into these unconnected fragments.
So ironically, by releasing these emails, WikiLeaks unintentionally provided the raw material for this entire conspiracy theory to be constructed.
That seems to be the case, yes. And this highlights the complex relationship between information access and transparency and the potential for that information to be manipulated.
It's almost like giving a toddler a loaded gun. Their intentions might be innocent, but the potential for harm is huge.
That's a rather stark analogy, but it does illustrate the point.
Okay, so we've seen how these researchers use narrative analysis to uncover the skeleton of the Pizzagate story.
Right.
But the online world is constantly changing. Did they look at how this narrative evolved over time?
They did. They focused on how Twitter activity around Pizzagate shifted during 5 key events.
Oh, this should be good. What were the 5 events?
The 2016 election, the Comet ping pong shooting.
Okay.
The day QAnon predicted a Trump-led coup.
Okay.
The death of Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay.
And finally, the banning of Pizzagate on TikTok.
Wow. So a mix of real-world events and events within the conspiracy theory itself?
Yeah.
What did they find? Did the narrative stay the same or change?
They found some significant changes, actually. For example, references to Satanism, which were initially quite common, dropped off considerably over time.
Interesting. Almost like the narrative was adjusting to fit the evolving political landscape.
Right. But what replaced the Satanism angle?
Mentions of Trump, particularly within the QAnon context, started to increase. It seems the focus shifted towards the idea that Trump was secretly battling this deep state cabal. Which QAnon claimed was behind Pizzagate.
Okay, so Pizzagate, which was already a totally baseless theory, got absorbed into this even bigger and equally baseless QAnon narrative.
Right.
And this shift happened as QAnon gained more followers and influence.
That's a reasonable interpretation, and you see this shift quite clearly when you look at the Twitter activity surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's death.
Ah, yes, Epstein, convicted sex offender with ties to powerful people.
Right.
His death definitely sparked a lot of online speculation.
It did.
How did Pizzagate figure into that?
Well, what's interesting is that while mentions of Trump within the Pizzagate context increased around Epstein's death, they often took on like a negative tone. So instead of Trump being the hero fighting against Pizzagate, some people started accusing him of being part of the problem.
Exactly. Some even suggested Trump was involved with Epstein's crimes.
Wow.
Which, of course, directly clashed with the QAnon narrative that painted Trump as a righteous crusader.
Wow. So even after getting wrapped up in this whole QAnon universe, the Pizzagate narrative could still fracture and adapt based on what was happening in the real world?
Precisely. These online narratives are incredibly fluid. They're constantly responding to new information and being shaped by the beliefs and agendas of those who spread them.
It's like a game of telephone, but on a global scale.
Yeah.
And with much higher stakes.
Right.
Now, you mentioned TikTok banning Pizzagate back in 2020.
Right.
I'm guessing that event provides some further insight into how this narrative continued to evolve?
It does. By that point, mentions of Satanism within the Pizzagate context had practically vanished. The focus had shifted almost entirely to Trump and QAnon, with some people even using Pizzagate to criticize Trump for not taking action against this supposed deep state.
So the satanic element, which was so central to the initial Pizzagate narrative, had pretty much faded away. It's amazing how much a conspiracy theory can morph over time.
It is quite remarkable, it seems. The narrative underwent a significant transformation, moving away from its occult origins and becoming almost entirely intertwined with QAnon.
Okay, so we've seen how this research unpacked the structure of the Pizzagate narrative and how it evolved over time.
Right.
But before we jump into the comparison with Bridgegate, I want to go back to something you said earlier.
Sure.
You called Pizzagate malleable.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a bit? What makes these online narratives so adaptable?
Well, one key factor is their inherent vagueness.
Okay.
Conspiracy theories often rely on broad, sweeping statements and avoid specific, verifiable details.
So, like, instead of saying, John Doe met with Jane Doe at this location on this date, it's more like, they are working together in the shadows.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is impossible to disprove because there's nothing concrete to refute.
Exactly. This vagueness allows a narrative to be easily molded to fit new information or events.
Okay.
And it also plays into another key characteristic of conspiracy theories, confirmation bias.
Oh, right. That's the tendency to seek out and favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Yes.
While ignoring or downplaying anything that contradicts them.
Precisely. And conspiracy theories thrive on confirmation bias.
Oh, okay.
Because they're often structured around the idea that they, the government, the media, etc., are hiding the truth from us.
Right.
Any attempt to debunk the theory can be interpreted as further proof of the conspiracy itself.
It's like a self-sealing system. No matter what evidence you present, it can always be twisted to fit the narrative.
Which makes these narratives incredibly resilient.
Right.
Even when debunked, they can persist and mutate, latching onto new events and reinforcing pre-existing biases.
It's kind of terrifying, really, how effective this can be.
It is.
And it highlights why understanding these narrative structures is so important, because once you see how the trick is done, it loses some of its power.
I completely agree. It's like learning how a magic trick works.
Right.
Once you understand the mechanics behind the illusion, it becomes much less impressive.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on Pizzagate and how its narrative was constructed.
Right.
Now let's shift gears and take a look at Bridgegate.
Okay.
I remember this was a genuine political conspiracy, right? It involved closing lanes on the George Washington Bridge.
Yes. In 2013, aides to New Jersey Governor Chris Christie orchestrated the closure of lanes on the bridge, seemingly for political retribution.
Right.
It caused major traffic jams.
Yeah.
And became a huge scandal.
Definitely not something you can just dismiss as an internet fantasy.
No.
So what did the researchers find when they compared the narrative structure of Bridgegate,
Right.
a real conspiracy, to that of Pizzagate,
Right.
a completely made-up one? Were there any noticeable differences?
There were some striking differences. For one, Bridgegate's narrative remained firmly within the realm of New Jersey politics.
Okay.
It didn't have this sprawling multi-domain structure we saw with Pizzagate.
So Bridgegate's narrative was more grounded in a specific context, whereas Pizzagate was able to connect those totally unrelated dots.
Right.
Does this mean that a broader scope generally points to a conspiracy theory?
It's not a foolproof rule, but it's certainly a red flag.
Okay.
Conspiracy theories often try to connect seemingly unrelated events and actors,
Right.
creating this sense of a grand overarching conspiracy controlling everything.
Which, again, plays into that confirmation bias we talked about. If everything is connected, then anything can be evidence.
Precisely. And the research has found another key difference in the network structures themselves.
Okay.
Bridgegate's network was far more robust,
Okay.
even when you removed key players like Chris Christie.
So even without the main villain, the story still held up.
Exactly. This likely stems from the fact that Bridgegate was a real event with multiple sources of evidence, court proceedings,
Right.
a complex web of relationships.
Okay.
The narrative was anchored in reality,
Right.
making it much more difficult to dismantle.
Whereas with Pizzagate, removing that key element, WikiLeaks essentially shattered the whole narrative. It makes sense that a story built on facts would be stronger than one built on speculation and conjecture.
That's a good way to put it.
This makes me think about the idea of burden of proof.
Okay.
With Bridgegate, the burden of proof was on those investigating the scandal, trying to uncover the truth.
Yeah.
But with Pizzagate, the burden of proof was constantly shifted onto those trying to debunk it.
That's a very astute observation. It's like the conspiracy theorists were saying, prove to me that this didn't happen.
Right.
Which is a much harder argument to win.
Especially online, where misinformation spreads so quickly and easily.
Right.
It's like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose.
A very apt analogy.
Right.
Yeah, and it highlights the inherent difficulty in combating these types of narratives.
Okay, so we've seen how the structure of Bridgegate, a real conspiracy, differed from Pizzagate.
Yes.
But what about the content of these narratives? What were some of the key themes and arguments that emerged from those thousands of Pizzagate posts?
One of the most prevalent themes, as you might expect, was this idea of a corrupt elite operating behind the scenes, pulling the strings, and controlling everything.
A classic conspiracy theory trope.
Right.
The powerful and privileged are always up to no good.
Yeah.
Who were the villains in the Pizzagate universe?
Well, it was a mix of Democratic politicians, wealthy donors, and even celebrities.
Okay.
Basically, anyone who fit into the pre-existing worldview of those spreading the theory.
And what were they accused of doing? Was it just about child trafficking, or did the accusations go even further?
The accusations got pretty extreme.
Okay.
We're talking pedophilia, satanic rituals, even cannibalism.
Wow, that escalated quickly.
Right.
It seems like with conspiracy theories, the accusations always seem to get more and more outlandish over time.
That's a common pattern, yes. It's about creating a sense of outrage and fear,
Right,
convincing people that the stakes are incredibly high,
right.
that civilization itself is at risk.
Which, of course, makes it easier to justify extreme actions like someone showing up at a pizza place with a gun.
Exactly. The narrative fuels a sense of urgency and moral righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
It makes people feel like they are the only ones who can stop this evil cabal,
Right.
that they are the heroes in this story.
So it's not just about believing the story, it's about feeling compelled to act on it. And that's when these narratives become truly dangerous.
I couldn't agree more. It's why it's so crucial to be aware of these patterns, to understand the tactics being used to spread these messages.
It's like learning self-defense against misinformation.
Right.
We need to be able to recognize the threats and protect ourselves from being manipulated.
And this deep dive into Pizzagate is providing us with some very valuable tools to do just that.
Right.
It's showing us how these narratives are built, how they spread,
Right.
and how they can evolve to fit new circumstances.
It's like a case study in how conspiracy theories operate, giving us insights that we can apply to other online narratives.
Exactly. And those insights are crucial for developing a healthy skepticism,
Right.
for not just accepting information at face value, but critically evaluating its sources, its structure,
Right.
and its potential biases.
So it's not about becoming cynical or distrusting everything we see online.
No, it's about developing a more discerning eye,
Okay.
being able to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
I love that analogy. We need to be able to tell the difference between nutritious information and empty calories.
And that's where this deep dive into Pizzagate is proving incredibly helpful. Now, before we move on to the final part of our analysis,
Okay.
I'm curious to get your take on something. We've talked a lot about the negative aspects of Pizzagate,
Yeah.
the misinformation, the danger,
Right.
the real-world consequences. But are there any positive takeaways from this research? Can we learn anything from Pizzagate that might help us improve our understanding of online communication and maybe even counter the spread of misinformation?
That's a great question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
It's a bit like finding a silver lining in a very dark cloud. But I do think there are some valuable lessons to be learned.
Okay.
For one, Pizzagate highlights the sheer power of narrative.
Right.
Even a completely fabricated story, if it's well-structured and taps into these,
All right.
existing fears and anxieties, can gain incredible traction online.
So even if the story itself is bogus, the way it's told can make it feel compelling, even believable to some people.
Exactly. It reminds us that, we humans are drawn to stories,
Uh-huh.
regardless of whether they're true or false.
Right.
And this understanding can actually be used to counter misinformation.
How so? Are you saying we should be fighting conspiracy theories with better stories?
In a way, yes. By crafting compelling counter-narratives that are grounded in facts and evidence, we might be able to disrupt the spread of those harmful
Right.
conspiracy theories.
So it's not just about debunking the false claims point by point.
Right.
It's about offering a more appealing and accurate alternative, almost like giving people a better path to follow.
That's a great way to put it. And Pizzagate also underscores the importance of media literacy.
Right.
Especially in today's world where information is so readily available.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be much more discerning consumers of what we read and see online.
It's like we need to develop a taste for quality information.
Yes.
To be able to distinguish between like the junk food and the nourishing meal.
I love that analogy. And developing that taste involves being aware of our own biases, questioning our assumptions,
Right.
and actively seeking out multiple perspectives.
So it's not about blindly trusting certain sources or dismissing others out of hand. It's about approaching information with a critical eye.
Yes.
No matter where it's coming from, always evaluate its credibility and be open to changing your mind when presented with new evidence.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of that saying, believe nothing you hear and only half of what you see.
Right.
Maybe a bit extreme.
Yeah.
But the sentiment is sound. Healthy skepticism is crucial in the digital age.
Okay, so Pizzagate has given us some insights into the power of narrative and the need for media literacy. What else can we take away from this?
I think it also highlights the crucial role of online moderation.
Okay.
Social media platforms have a responsibility to prevent the spread of harmful content,
Right.
including conspiracy theories.
I could see how that's a tough balancing act. On the one hand, freedom of speech is essential.
Right.
But on the other, you don't want these platforms to become breeding grounds for dangerous misinformation.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance
Right.
between protecting free expression and safeguarding the well-being of users and society as a whole.
So this isn't just an issue for the tech companies to figure out.
Yeah.
It's something we all need to be thinking about.
It is.
How do we create a healthier online environment where free speech can thrive without allowing harmful content to run rampant?
Precisely. It requires collaboration between tech companies, policymakers, and even individual users.
Right.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future of the internet.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the structure of Pizzagate's narrative to its evolution over time and the insights we can glean from it.
Right.
Now let's circle back to that comparison with Bridgegate.
Okay.
We left off talking about how Bridgegate, being a real conspiracy, had a more robust narrative structure.
Right.
Firmly rooted in the realm of New Jersey politics. What other differences did the researchers uncover?
One key distinction lies in how the villains were portrayed.
Okay.
In each narrative. In Pizzagate,
Right.
the accused were often depicted as almost cartoonishly evil, engaging in shocking and depraved acts. It was a very black and white, good versus evil portrayal.
Which, of course, feeds into that emotional intensity that makes these theories so compelling. You're not just presented with facts.
Right.
You're presented with a battle between good and pure evil.
Exactly. But in the Bridgegate narrative, things were much more nuanced.
Okay.
The individuals involved were portrayed as complex figures with their own motivations, flaws, and even moments of sympathy.
Which makes sense because real life is rarely as simple as good versus evil.
Right.
People are complicated.
Precisely. And this difference in portrayal also reflects a broader distinction between how evidence is used in these narratives.
Okay.
In Pizzagate, evidence was often cherry-picked, distorted,
Right.
or even fabricated to fit the pre-existing narrative.
It's like they started with the conclusion they wanted and then worked backwards, searching for anything that could be twisted to support their claims.
That's a very apt description. But in the Bridgegate narrative, evidence was presented in a much more systematic and objective manner.
Right.
There was a focus on verifiable facts, court documents, and eyewitness accounts.
So with Bridgegate, the story unfolded as more evidence came to light. It wasn't about forcing the evidence to fit a predetermined narrative.
Exactly. And this difference in how evidence is presented also highlights the importance of critical thinking skills.
Right.
Especially when encountering information online.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to evaluate the sources, assess the credibility of the claims being made,
Right.
and look for any signs of bias or manipulation.
It's like being a detective. You don't just accept the first version of events you hear. You look for inconsistencies.
Right.
Gather evidence.
Yeah.
And try to piece together the most accurate picture possible.
That's a great analogy. And developing these critical thinking skills is more important than ever
Right.
in today's information-saturated world.
Okay, so we've seen how Pizzagate and Bridgegate differ in terms of their scope, their portrayal of the accused, and their use of evidence.
Yes. Any other key distinctions that stand out? One final point I'd like to highlight is the role of emotion in these narratives.
Okay.
Conspiracy theories, by their very nature, often tap into these, deep-seated fears and anxieties.
Absolutely, whether it's fear of the government, fear of the other, or even just a general sense of powerlessness.
Right.
These theories provide a framework for understanding and coping with those anxieties.
Exactly. And Pizzagate was no exception.
Okay.
It played into fears about child safety, elite corruption,
Right.
and even satanic cults.
It's almost like these theories offer a perverse sense of comfort.
Right.
Yes, the world is a scary place, but at least I know who the enemy is.
That's a very insightful observation, and this emotional component makes it even more difficult to counter these narratives with facts and logic alone.
Because you're not just battling misinformation.
Right.
You're battling deeply ingrained emotions and worldviews.
Precisely, and this highlights the need for empathy and understanding when engaging with people who believe in conspiracy theories. Simply dismissing them as crazy or stupid is unlikely to be effective.
It's about meeting people where they are, acknowledging their fears and anxieties,
Right.
and offering alternative explanations that address those underlying emotional needs.
Exactly. It's a challenging task.
Right.
But it's essential if we want to create a more informed and resilient society. Now, before we wrap up this discussion, I'd like to shift our focus to the broader implications of this research.
Okay.
We've talked extensively about Pizzagate and Bridgegate.
Right.
But what can these case studies tell us about the bigger picture of online misinformation?
Okay.
Are there any patterns or trends that emerge?
That's a great question. It feels like we've been digging into this specific case study, but what can we learn about how these narratives work in general? What's the takeaway for anyone scrolling through their social media feeds? That's a great question. It feels like we've been digging into this specific case study, but what can we learn about how these narratives work in general? What's the takeaway for anyone scrolling through their social media feeds?
I think one of the most striking takeaways is how these narratives exploit our natural tendency to seek patterns and meaning in the world.
Okay.
You know, we're wired to connect the dots, to look for cause and effect.
So it's not that people who believe in conspiracy theories are necessarily gullible or irrational. It's that they're applying that natural instinct for pattern recognition in a way that can lead them astray.
Exactly. And in the online world where information is fragmented and often decontextualized,
Right.
it's easier than ever to fall into these traps of misinterpretation.
Right.
Another key takeaway is the importance of emotional resonance.
Okay.
Conspiracy theories often tap into these, very real fears and anxieties, providing a sense of certainty and control in a world that can feel increasingly chaotic and unpredictable.
So it's not just about the facts of the theory, it's about how those facts make people feel.
Precisely. And this emotional component is what makes these narratives so sticky.
Okay.
They offer a sense of belonging, of being in the know,
Right.
of having access to these hidden truths that others are oblivious to.
Which creates a really strong incentive to believe, even when the evidence is flimsy or non-existent. If you're emotionally invested in a particular narrative, you're less likely to be swayed by facts that challenge your beliefs.
That's a key insight, and it highlights the limitations of simply debunking conspiracy theories with facts and logic.
Right.
We also need to address the underlying emotional needs that these narratives are fulfilling.
So it's not just about winning the argument, it's about understanding where the other person is coming from and having a more nuanced and empathetic conversation.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial takeaway. The importance of building resilience to misinformation.
Okay.
We need to equip ourselves with the tools and the critical thinking skills necessary to navigate the complex
Right.
and often misleading world of online information.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete steps people can take to become more resilient to these narratives?
Well, first and foremost, be aware of your own biases.
Okay.
We all have them.
Right.
And they can influence how we interpret information.
Right.
Ask yourself, am I seeking out information that confirms my existing beliefs? Am I dismissing information that challenges my worldview?
It's about being honest with yourself and being willing to challenge your own assumptions. That's not always easy.
It's not, but it's crucial.
Right.
Another important step is to diversify your information sources.
Okay.
Don't just rely on a single news outlet or social media platform.
Right.
Expose yourself to a variety of perspectives and viewpoints.
That makes sense. If you're only hearing one side of the story, it's easy to get sucked into a particular narrative.
And finally, be critical of everything you read online.
Okay.
Ask yourself, who is sharing this information? What is their agenda? What evidence do they have to support their claims?
It's like that old saying, trust, but verify. Don't just take things at face value. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions.
I think those are excellent takeaways. And remember, building resilience to misinformation is an ongoing process.
Right.
It's not a one-time fix. It's a set of skills and habits that we need to cultivate and practice regularly.
It's like building a muscle.
Yes.
The more you exercise your critical thinking skills, the stronger they become.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, I think this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
It has.
We've explored the anatomy of a conspiracy theory, comparing the fabricated narrative of Pizzagate to the real-world conspiracy of Bridgegate.
Right.
And we've discussed some practical strategies for building resilience to misinformation online. Exactly. Remember, knowledge is power, and in the digital age, critical thinking is our most valuable weapon. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay skeptical.